My name is Rebecca Matthews, and I'm 26 years old. 3 days before Christmas, my phone rang with the call that would change everything. My mother's voice was ice cold as she delivered words I never thought I'd hear. "Rebecca, we've decided you're not welcome at Christmas this year. Your behavior at Thanksgiving was completely inappropriate, and we can't have that kind of negativity around the family during the holidays." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my laptop screen where my secret trust fund balance glowed like a beacon of hope. $100 million they had no idea I'd discovered. Before we dive into this incredible journey of betrayal, revenge, and justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to smash that like button and hit subscribe because this story is going to take you on the wildest ride through family drama you've ever seen. Trust me, what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless, so buckle up for a Christmas tale unlike any other. The phone call wasn't the beginning of my nightmare, it was just the moment everything finally became crystal clear. Let me take you back to Thanksgiving, just 1 month earlier, when I made what I thought was a simple decision that would destroy my relationship with my family forever. I brought my girlfriend Sarah to dinner, something I'd been building up the courage to do for over a year. Sarah Chin was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: intelligent, kind, successful in her own right as a pediatric nurse, and most importantly, she loved me for exactly who I was. We'd been together for 18 months, and I was tired of hiding the most important person in my life from my family. The moment we walked through the front door of my childhood home in suburban Atlanta, the atmosphere shifted. My mother Linda's smile faltered when I introduced Sarah as my girlfriend, not just my friend as I'd hinted over the phone. My father Robert's face went through a series of expressions that ranged from confusion to disgust to pure rage. But it was my siblings' reactions that truly broke my heart. My older brother Jake, 30 years old and supposedly the mature one in the family, immediately started making snide comments under his breath about how this explained why I'd never brought home any decent men. My younger sister Lisa, 24 and always my closest confidant growing up, just stared at us like we were some kind of circus act she couldn't quite believe she was witnessing. The dinner itself was a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. Every comment was loaded with double meanings, every question designed to make Sarah feel unwelcome and uncomfortable. When my mother asked Sarah about her family background and discovered she was of Chinese descent, the conversation took an even uglier turn with barely concealed racist undertones wrapped in fake concern about cultural differences. My father spent the entire meal making pointed comments about traditional families and the importance of carrying on the family name through proper marriages and grandchildren. But the real explosion came when I finally snapped and told them all exactly what I thought about their behavior. I stood up at that dining room table, surrounded by the same furniture I'd eaten countless meals at growing up, and I told my family that I was proud to be gay, proud to be with Sarah, and that their approval wasn't required for me to live my authentic life. The silence that followed was deafening. Then my father stood up, his face purple with rage, and told me to get out of his house and never come back until I came to my senses and stopped this disgusting phase I was going through. What I discovered later, through a mutual friend, was that my sister Lisa had been secretly recording parts of our argument on her phone. She'd captured my emotional breakdown, the moment when I broke down crying after being called an abomination by my own father, and she'd shared it with our extended family as evidence that I was having some kind of mental breakdown. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends. They'd all seen me at my most vulnerable moment, but not the context of what had driven me to that point. Lisa had edited out all the cruel things our parents had said, making it look like I'd just exploded out of nowhere in an unstable rage. The weeks following Thanksgiving were filled with attempts at reconciliation that went nowhere. Every time I tried to call and explain, my mother would cut me off and tell me that until I was ready to apologize for my behavior and seek help for my obvious mental health issues, they weren't interested in hearing from me. My brother Jake sent me long text messages about how disappointed he was in my choices and how I was destroying our family's reputation. Even Lisa, who I'd hoped might understand since she'd always been the rebellious one, sent me articles about conversion therapy and suggested that maybe I just needed to find the right man. Through all of this chaos and heartbreak, there was one person who reached out with love and support: my grandmother Rose. At 82 years old, Grandma Rose was the strongest person I'd ever known. She'd survived the Great Depression, raised 5 children mostly on her own after my grandfather died young, and had always been the glue that held our extended family together. When she called me 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, her voice was gentle but firm. She told me that she'd heard about what happened, that she was proud of me for being honest about who I was, and that she'd always suspected I might be gay, but had been waiting for me to feel safe enough to share that part of myself. It was during that conversation with Grandma Rose that she mentioned something that would change everything. She asked me if I'd ever looked into the trust fund my grandfather had set up for me before he died. I was confused because my parents had always told me that grandfather had left everything to them, with the understanding that they'd provide for my education and help me get started in life. Grandma Rose's voice got very quiet, and she told me that wasn't true. She suggested I might want to do some digging into my grandfather's estate because there were things my parents had never told me. That conversation sent me down a rabbit hole that would expose lies that had been told for over a decade. I started with simple internet searches and public records, but what I found made my blood run cold. There was indeed a trust fund in my name, established by my grandfather when I was 15 years old, with a value that had grown to over $100 million through careful investments and compound interest. The trust was supposed to be fully accessible to me at age 25, which meant I'd been legally entitled to that money for over a year without knowing it even existed. The more I dug into the financial records, the angrier I became. Everything about my childhood suddenly made sense, but not in the way I'd always believed. My parents had always portrayed themselves as hardworking middle-class people who struggled to make ends meet. They'd taught me the value of money by constantly talking about budgets and saving for important things. When I wanted to go to summer camps that cost more than a few $100s, they'd explain that we just couldn't afford luxuries like that. When my friends got cars for their 16th birthdays, my parents told me I'd need to work and save for my own transportation because they couldn't justify such an expensive gift. But now I was looking at bank records that told a completely different story. My parents had been receiving monthly distributions from my trust fund for administrative purposes, supposedly to cover my living expenses and education costs. What they'd actually been doing was funneling that money into their own accounts and using it to fund a lifestyle that was far more luxurious than anything I'd ever seen growing up. They'd bought a vacation home in the mountains that they'd told me belonged to my father's company. They'd taken elaborate trips to Europe and Asia that they'd claimed were business-related. My mother's expensive jewelry collection, my father's luxury car purchases, even the renovations to our family home had all been funded with my inheritance. The documentation was overwhelming and heartbreaking. I found receipts for private school tuition for my siblings that totaled more than most people make in a year. I discovered that Jake's college education had been paid for entirely through my trust fund, including graduate school and a hefty down payment on his first house. Lisa's wedding the previous year, which had been held at an exclusive country club and had cost more than $200,000, had been funded completely with my money. Meanwhile, I'd worked multiple jobs throughout college to pay for my own education and had graduated with student loan debt that I was still paying off. But the most damaging discovery was a series of forged documents that showed my parents had been systematically stealing from the trust by claiming expenses that were either completely fabricated or grossly inflated. They'd billed the trust for my living expenses at amounts that were triple what I'd actually cost them to raise. They'd claimed educational expenses for private tutors and special programs that had never existed. They'd even charged the trust for medical expenses that had been covered by insurance, essentially double billing and pocketing the difference. When I finally worked up the courage to confront my family's lawyer, Harrison Mitchell, I discovered the full scope of the deception. Mr. Mitchell had been the one managing the trust since my grandfather's death, and he'd been complicit in everything my parents had done. When I walked into his office with copies of the financial records I'd uncovered, his face went pale. He tried to convince me that everything had been legitimate, that my parents had been acting in my best interests, and that the trust had specific provisions that allowed for broad interpretations of appropriate expenses. But I'd done my homework, and I knew he was lying. I'd obtained copies of the original trust documents, and they were very clear about how the money could be used. Educational expenses had to be directly related to my schooling, living expenses had to be reasonable and documented, and any distributions over certain amounts required my explicit consent once I turned 18. None of that had happened. For the past 8 years, my parents had been stealing from me with the help of their lawyer, and they'd all been counting on the fact that I'd never think to look into my grandfather's estate. The confrontation with Mr. Mitchell ended with him threatening me with legal action if I pursued the matter further. He claimed that I was unstable and suggested that my parents had every right to manage my finances until I could prove I was mentally competent to handle such a large inheritance. It was clear that this had been their plan all along, keep me in the dark about the money until I was 30, and by then they'd have found ways to justify every penny they'd stolen. They'd created a paper trail that made it look like they'd been responsible guardians managing my affairs, when in reality they'd been embezzling millions of dollars while teaching me to live like we were barely getting by. That night, I called Grandma Rose and told her everything I discovered. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with guilt and anger. She told me that she'd suspected something wasn't right for years. She'd noticed that my parents seemed to have a lot more money than they'd ever had before my grandfather died, but when she'd asked them about it, they'd told her they'd made some good investments and that business was going well for my father. She'd also wondered why I seemed to be struggling financially as a young adult when she knew my grandfather had specifically set up the trust to ensure I'd be taken care of. Grandma Rose apologized for not looking into things sooner, but she explained that she'd had no legal standing to demand information about the trust. As my grandfather's widow, she had no rights to the estate once it had been distributed according to his will. She'd tried to ask me directly about the trust a few times over the years, but my parents had always been present during family gatherings, and she'd never found the right moment to have a private conversation about such sensitive financial matters. But now that I knew the truth, Grandma Rose was ready to help me fight back. She had kept copies of personal letters my grandfather had written to her about his intentions for the trust, letters that made it clear he'd wanted me to have access to the money as soon as I was mature enough to handle it responsibly. She also had photographs and documentation of family events that could help prove my parents had been living beyond their apparent means. Most importantly, she had her own relationship with a lawyer she'd used for estate planning, someone who wasn't connected to my family's financial advisors and could give me honest guidance about my legal options. The decision to take legal action against my own family was the hardest thing I'd ever contemplated. These were the people who'd raised me, who'd been at every birthday party and school play and graduation ceremony. But they were also the people who'd been systematically stealing from me for years, while teaching me to live with financial anxiety and limitations that were completely unnecessary. They'd allowed me to struggle through college working multiple jobs when I could have focused on my education. They'd watched me stress about student loan payments and entry-level salaries while they were living in luxury funded by my inheritance. The first step in building my case was finding the right legal representation. Grandma Rose's attorney, Patricia Wong, was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in estate law and had seen plenty of family financial disputes over the years. When I sat in her office and laid out the evidence I'd gathered, she was quiet for a long time, reviewing documents and making notes. Finally, she looked up at me and said that what my parents had done was not just morally wrong, it was criminal fraud on a massive scale. She estimated that they'd stolen at least $15 million from the trust over the years, and possibly more once we conducted a full forensic accounting. Patricia explained that I had several options for how to proceed. I could file a quiet civil lawsuit and try to recover the stolen funds through the courts, which would take years and might allow my parents to hide or spend additional assets before they could be frozen. I could report the theft to law enforcement and pursue criminal charges, which would be faster but might result in my family members going to prison. Or I could try to handle things privately by confronting my parents with the evidence and demanding restitution, though Patricia warned that this approach rarely worked in cases involving this much money and deception. While I was wrestling with these legal options, I was also dealing with the emotional fallout of the Christmas disinvitation. Sarah had been incredibly supportive throughout my investigation into the trust fund, and she was furious on my behalf about both the financial theft and the way my family had treated me after Thanksgiving. She pointed out that my parents' timing was particularly cruel since they'd waited until I was at my most vulnerable emotionally to cut me out of the holiday celebrations. It was as if they'd sensed that I might be getting close to discovering their secrets and had decided to isolate me from the rest of the family before I could expose them. That's when Sarah suggested something that would become the centerpiece of my revenge plan, going public with the entire story. She pointed out that my family's greatest fear was public embarrassment and damage to their reputation in the community. They'd built their social standing on the image of being a successful, traditional family with strong values. If I could expose both their financial crimes and their treatment of me as a gay woman, it would destroy everything they'd worked to build. The idea of going public was terrifying, but also incredibly appealing. For years, I'd been the one hiding parts of myself to keep the peace with my family. I downplayed my career success to avoid making my siblings feel bad about their own choices. I'd hidden my relationship with Sarah to avoid confronting my parents' homophobia. I'd accepted their version of our family's financial situation without questioning why things didn't always add up. But now I had the power to tell my own story, and I had the financial resources to do it in a way that would get maximum attention. Sarah and I spent hours researching different platforms and strategies for sharing the story. Traditional media felt too slow and too controlled by editors who might not understand the full scope of what had happened. Social media platforms had too many limitations on the length and format of content. But live streaming offered the perfect combination of immediacy, authenticity, and reach. I could tell the entire story in my own words, show the evidence in real time, and respond to questions and comments from viewers as the story unfolded. The more we planned, the more excited I became about the possibilities. This wasn't just about getting revenge on my family, though that was certainly part of it. This was about taking control of my own narrative and using my story to help other people who might be dealing with similar situations. Family financial abuse was more common than most people realized, and LGBTQ individuals were particularly vulnerable to being cut off from family resources when they came out. If I could use my platform to raise awareness about these issues while also holding my family accountable for their actions, then maybe something positive could come out of all the pain they'd caused. But I knew I couldn't do this alone, and the most important ally I needed was Grandma Rose. When I called to ask if she'd be willing to join me for a trip to Paris over Christmas, she was quiet for a moment. Then she started laughing, a sound I hadn't heard from her since before Thanksgiving. She told me that she'd been hoping for years that someone would finally stand up to my parents and their bullying behavior. She'd watched them manipulate and control everyone in the family, and she was tired of pretending that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for what was right. Grandma Rose had her own reasons for wanting to see my parents face consequences for their actions. She revealed that they'd been pressuring her to move into a nursing home so they could sell her house and use the proceeds to pay for their own retirement. They'd been telling her that she was becoming too much of a burden for the family to handle, when in reality she was still sharp as a tack and perfectly capable of living independently. She suspected that they were hoping to gain control of her finances the same way they'd controlled mine, and she was ready to fight back before it was too late. The Paris trip was perfect cover for what we were really planning. My parents would assume I was being frivolous and irresponsible with money I didn't have, which would reinforce their narrative that I wasn't mature enough to handle serious financial decisions. They'd be so focused on judging my choices that they wouldn't realize I was gathering final pieces of evidence and preparing to expose everything they'd done. And having Grandma Rose with me would add credibility to my story, while also protecting her from any retaliation attempts before the truth came out. Planning the logistics of the trip was both exciting and nerve-wracking. I booked us first-class flights on Air France and reserved a suite at the Hotel Plaza Athénée, one of the most expensive hotels in Paris. The total cost for a week-long stay was more than most people made in several months, but it was a tiny fraction of what my parents had stolen from me over the years. Every expensive choice was deliberate. I wanted to live openly with the wealth that was rightfully mine, and I wanted my family to see that I had access to resources they couldn't control or take away. The streaming setup required careful planning as well. I researched lighting equipment and camera angles to make sure the video quality would be professional enough to hold viewers' attention for what might be a very long broadcast. I practiced telling the story multiple times, timing different segments to make sure I could cover all the important details without the stream becoming too long or losing momentum. Most importantly, I organized all my evidence into a clear, logical sequence that would be easy for viewers to follow and understand. As our departure date approached, I could feel my family getting more suspicious about the trip. My mother called several times asking pointed questions about how I could afford such an expensive vacation, especially since I'd been complaining about student loan payments and entry-level salary limitations for years. My father sent me articles about responsible financial planning and the importance of building savings before indulging in luxury travel. Jake texted me constantly with warnings about how I was probably being scammed by Sarah or making impulsive decisions based on emotional instability. But their concern felt hollow and manipulative rather than genuine. These were the same people who'd been stealing millions from me while lecturing me about the value of hard work and financial responsibility. Their sudden interest in my spending habits had nothing to do with caring about my well-being and everything to do with maintaining control over the narrative they'd created about my life and my character. The morning we left for Paris, I sent my family a casual group text that was designed to sound like I was making a spontaneous, probably irresponsible decision. Hey everyone! Grandma Rose and I decided to spend Christmas in Paris this year. Figured it was time for both of us to see the world and make some new memories. See you when we get back. I attached a selfie of Grandma Rose and me at the airport, both of us grinning like we were about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. The response was immediate and exactly what I'd expected. My mother called within minutes, demanding to know how I thought I could afford such a trip and whether I'd lost my mind spending money I didn't have. When I didn't answer, she started texting increasingly frantic messages about responsibility and financial planning. My father sent a long email about how disappointed he was in my decision-making and how this proved that I needed better guidance in managing my life. Jake called Grandma Rose directly, trying to convince her that I was having some kind of breakdown and that she should come home immediately instead of enabling my reckless behavior. But Lisa's reaction was the most telling of all. She posted on social media about how worried the family was about my mental health and how I was dragging poor Grandma Rose into my unstable schemes. She painted herself as the concerned sister who just wanted what was best for everyone, conveniently leaving out any mention of her role in sabotaging my relationship with the family after Thanksgiving. Her post got dozens of sympathetic comments from family, friends, and extended relatives, all expressing concern about my apparent downward spiral and praising my siblings for trying to help me during such a difficult time. The flight to Paris was surreal. Grandma Rose had never flown first class before, and watching her delight in the comfortable seats, the gourmet meal service, and the attentive flight staff made me realize how many experiences my parents' lies had stolen from both of us. She should have been traveling in luxury for years, funded by the family wealth that was partly her late husband's legacy. Instead, she'd been living modestly on Social Security while my parents used trust fund money to finance their own comfortable lifestyle. During the 8-hour flight, Grandma Rose and I talked more openly than we ever had before. She told me stories about my grandfather that my parents had never shared, including his specific wishes for how his wealth should be used to benefit future generations of the family. He'd envisioned the trust fund as a way to give his descendants freedom to pursue education, start businesses, travel the world, and make positive contributions to their communities. He would have been horrified to know that his money was being used to maintain appearances and fund luxury purchases for people who already had more than enough. Grandma Rose also shared her perspective on my parents' behavior over the years, things she'd noticed but had never felt comfortable discussing with anyone else in the family. She'd seen how they treated me differently from my siblings, always expecting more from me while providing less support and encouragement. She'd watched them dismiss my achievements and minimize my struggles in ways that seemed designed to keep me dependent and insecure. Looking back, she realized that they'd been systematically undermining my confidence so I wouldn't question their control over my life and my finances. When we arrived at the Hotel Plaza Athénée, the staff treated us like royalty. Our suite overlooked the Eiffel Tower and was more luxurious than any place I'd ever stayed. Grandma Rose kept touching the silk curtains and marble surfaces like she couldn't believe they were real. That evening, we had dinner at the hotel's Michelin-starred restaurant, where a single meal cost more than I'd usually spend on food in a month. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the expense. This was my money that should have been available to me for years, and I was finally free to use it the way my grandfather had intended. The next few days were a whirlwind of tourist activities that served as perfect cover for my real preparations. We visited the Louvre and the Arc de Triomphe, took a boat cruise along the Seine, and spent hours wandering through the Christmas markets. I documented everything on social media, posting photos that showed us living it up in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Each post was calculated to increase my family's anxiety about my spending and their suspicion about where I was getting the money. But while we were sightseeing during the day, I was working late into the night setting up the technical aspects of the live stream. I tested camera angles and lighting setups, practiced my presentation with Grandma Rose, and organized all my evidence into easily accessible digital formats. I created backup plans for technical difficulties and researched the optimal timing for maximum viewership. Most importantly, I prepared emotionally for what was going to be the most difficult conversation of my life, even though it would be happening in front of potentially thousands of strangers. The evidence I'd gathered was overwhelming, but I knew I needed to present it in a way that would be clear and compelling to people who weren't familiar with estate law or financial documentation. I created visual aids that showed the flow of money from the trust fund to my parents' accounts, side-by-side comparisons of their stated income versus their actual spending, and timelines that demonstrated the systematic nature of the theft. I also prepared personal stories that would help viewers understand the emotional impact of what had been done to me, not just the financial aspects. Grandma Rose was an incredible partner in this preparation process. She helped me practice telling the story in a way that was chronological and easy to follow, and she contributed her own perspective on events I'd been too young to understand at the time. She also helped me prepare for the inevitable backlash from my family, reminding me that standing up for the truth was worth whatever consequences might come from exposing their lies. By our fourth day in Paris, my family's phone calls and messages had reached a fever pitch. My mother was demanding that I call her immediately to explain how I was paying for the trip. My father had contacted his lawyer to ask about options for intervening in what he described as my obvious mental health crisis. Jake had posted his own social media message asking for prayers for his sister, who was clearly having some kind of breakdown. Even extended family members were reaching out to express concern about my behavior and offer to help bring me home before I did any more damage to myself financially. But the most telling response came from Harrison Mitchell, the family lawyer who'd been helping my parents steal from the trust fund. He sent me a formal legal letter demanding that I return to the United States immediately to discuss irregularities in my financial accounts. He claimed that there were questions about unauthorized access to estate funds and that my continued absence from the country could be interpreted as an attempt to flee from legal consequences. The letter was clearly designed to intimidate me into backing down, but it actually had the opposite effect. It confirmed that my parents knew I'd discovered their theft, and they were panicking about what I might do with that information. That night, Grandma Rose and I had a serious conversation about the point of no return. Once I went live with the stream and told the world what my family had done, there would be no taking it back. Our relationships with them would be permanently destroyed, and there might be legal and financial consequences that we couldn't predict. Grandma Rose took my hands in hers and told me something I'll never forget. "Rebecca, honey, those relationships were destroyed the moment they chose to steal from you and lie to you for all these years. All you're doing now is refusing to keep their secrets for them anymore." On our 5th day in Paris, I woke up to a message from the hotel concierge informing me that my parents had arrived and were demanding to see me immediately. They'd somehow managed to book a last-minute flight and were currently in the lobby, insisting that I was in danger and needed to return home with them immediately. My first instinct was panic, but Grandma Rose reminded me that we were in a foreign country where my parents had no legal authority over me, and I was a 26-year-old adult who couldn't be forced to go anywhere against my will. When I went down to the lobby to confront them, the scene was even more dramatic than I'd expected. My mother was in tears, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter was having a mental breakdown and needed immediate medical intervention. My father was pacing angrily, demanding that the hotel staff help him access my room so he could assess my mental state. Jake had come with them, and he was trying to present himself as the calm, reasonable family member who just wanted to help his troubled sister get the professional help she obviously needed. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced with my family. When they saw me approaching, my mother rushed over and tried to grab my arm, telling me that they were there to take me home where I could get proper care for my obvious psychological problems. My father immediately started demanding explanations for my spending and threatening to have me committed for psychiatric evaluation if I couldn't provide satisfactory answers about my financial decisions. But it was Jake's behavior that truly shocked me. He pulled out a folder of legal documents and started reading from what he claimed was a psychological evaluation that proved I was incompetent to manage my own affairs. When I demanded to see the documents, he refused, saying that I wasn't in a stable enough mental state to understand complex legal concepts. He then announced that the family had filed for emergency guardianship over me, claiming that my recent behavior proved I was a danger to myself and potentially others. I realized in that moment that this had all been planned. The psychological evaluation, the guardianship petition, even their sudden arrival in Paris, it was all part of a coordinated effort to maintain control over me and the trust fund money before I could expose what they'd done. They'd probably been working on this strategy since Thanksgiving, building a case that my coming out and my relationship with Sarah were evidence of mental instability rather than simply me living authentically for the first time in my life. The hotel security team was called when the argument escalated, and I was grateful that the staff took my side rather than automatically deferring to my parents' claims about my mental health. The security manager, a professional woman named Marie Dubois, listened to both sides of the story and then informed my family that they couldn't force me to leave with them or gain access to my room without proper legal authorization from French authorities. She also pointed out that their behavior in the lobby was disturbing other guests and that they would need to either calm down or leave the premises. That's when Grandma Rose made her entrance, and it was magnificent. At 82 years old, she walked into that lobby with more dignity and authority than any of my younger family members could muster. She looked my parents directly in the eye and told them exactly what she thought of their behavior. She said that she'd watched them manipulate and control everyone in the family for years, and she was disgusted by their attempts to paint me as mentally unstable simply because I'd discovered their financial crimes and chosen to live openly as a gay woman. My mother tried to dismiss Grandma Rose's words by suggesting that she was also becoming confused and unreliable due to her age, which was a huge mistake. Grandma Rose had been sharp as a tack her entire life, and she didn't appreciate being patronized by people she'd watched grow up. She informed my parents that she had copies of all my grandfather's personal papers and letters, including documentation of his specific intentions for the trust fund that proved they'd been violating his wishes for years. She also mentioned that she'd been keeping detailed records of their suspicious financial behavior and that she was fully prepared to support me in any legal action I chose to pursue. The mention of legal action seemed to panic my family in a way that surprised me. Jake immediately started backtracking on his claims about the guardianship petition, suggesting that maybe it was all just a misunderstanding that could be worked out privately. My mother switched tactics and tried to appeal to my emotions, talking about how much the family missed me and how we could work through any problems if I would just come home and talk things through rationally. My father remained angry and demanding, but even he seemed to realize that their intimidation tactics weren't working in this environment. But the most revealing moment came when Jake pulled me aside and tried to make a deal. He offered to help me access a portion of the trust fund money if I would agree to keep quiet about what I'd discovered and return home with them. He suggested that maybe there had been some bookkeeping errors over the years, but that everything could be straightened out privately without involving lawyers or making public accusations that would damage the family's reputation. The fact that he was willing to admit to financial improprieties while still trying to control the narrative told me everything I needed to know about their desperation. I told Jake that it was too late for private settlements or family meetings. I explained that I'd already consulted with lawyers and that the evidence of systematic theft was overwhelming and undeniable. I also informed him that I had no intention of protecting their reputation at the expense of my own financial security and emotional well-being. If they were worried about public embarrassment, they should have thought about that before they decided to steal millions of dollars from their own daughter while teaching her to live like she was barely getting by. The conversation ended with my parents threatening to contact the American Embassy and claim that I was being held against my will by Sarah or other unspecified criminals who were manipulating me for financial gain. They suggested that my relationship with Sarah was evidence that I was vulnerable to exploitation and that my sudden access to large amounts of money proved I was being scammed or coerced. These threats were so absurd and desperate that even Jake seemed embarrassed by them, but they also showed me how far my parents were willing to go to maintain control over the situation. After they finally left the hotel, I was shaking with adrenaline and anger. The confrontation had been more intense than I'd expected, and it had confirmed that my family was willing to use any tactics necessary to prevent me from exposing their crimes. The fake psychological evaluation and guardianship threats were particularly disturbing because they showed a level of premeditation and coordination that I hadn't anticipated. They'd been planning to discredit me for weeks, possibly months, and they were prepared to have me institutionalized rather than face the consequences of their theft. But the confrontation had also strengthened my resolve to move forward with the live stream. If my family was this desperate to silence me, it meant that the truth would be even more damaging to them than I'd realized. They weren't just worried about returning the money they'd stolen. They were terrified of the public exposure that would come with being revealed as thieves and manipulators who'd been living a lie for years. The fact that they'd flown to Paris to try to stop me proved that they understood the power of what I was planning to do. That night, Grandma rose and I finalized our preparations for the live stream. We decided to move forward immediately rather than waiting for our originally planned date because it was clear that my family was going to keep escalating their efforts to stop me. We spent hours rehearsing the presentation one final time, making sure that all the evidence was organized and easily accessible, and preparing for the technical and emotional challenges of broadcasting such a personal story to potentially thousands of strangers. The next morning brought devastating news that I should have anticipated, but somehow hadn't prepared for. I received a call from Patricia Wong informing me that my parents had succeeded in obtaining an emergency court order freezing all of my accounts, including my access to the trust fund. They'd presented the fake psychological evaluation and claimed that I was in immediate danger of squandering my inheritance due to mental incapacity and possible manipulation by unscrupulous individuals. The court had issued a temporary restraining order that would remain in effect until a full hearing could be scheduled, which might not happen for several weeks. The timing couldn't have been worse. I was in one of the most expensive cities in the world, staying at a luxury hotel that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent, with no access to the funds I needed to pay for any of it. My personal checking account had enough money to cover a few days of basic expenses, but nowhere near enough to handle the bills I'd already incurred for the trip. I was facing the humiliating prospect of having to ask the hotel for payment extensions or, even worse, calling my family to beg them to wire me money to get home. But the financial crisis was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of watching my family's manipulation tactics succeed. After years of being told that I was irresponsible and needed their guidance to make good decisions, they'd managed to convince a judge that I was mentally incompetent based on fabricated evidence and their own testimony about my recent behavior. The fact that a legal authority had validated their claims about my mental state, even temporarily, made me question whether I really was as capable and independent as I'd thought. The situation got worse when Grandma Rose suffered what appeared to be a heart episode that afternoon. She'd been feeling chest pains and shortness of breath since the confrontation with my parents, and the stress of the financial crisis seemed to push her over the edge. I called for emergency medical services, and she was rushed to a nearby hospital where doctors ran a series of tests to determine whether she'd had an actual heart attack or just a severe anxiety reaction to the emotional trauma. Sitting in that hospital waiting room, not knowing whether Grandma Rose was going to be okay, and facing the possibility that I might not be able to pay for her medical care either, I came closer to giving up than I ever had before. It felt like my parents had won through sheer ruthlessness and manipulation, and that my attempts to fight back had only made things worse for everyone involved. I started to wonder whether it would be better to just surrender, return home with them, and accept whatever settlement they were willing to offer in exchange for keeping quiet about what I discovered. The guilt was overwhelming. Grandma Rose was in the hospital because I dragged her into my fight with my family. She'd been living peacefully in her assisted living facility, and I'd convinced her to take sides in a conflict that had nothing to do with her. If something serious happened to her because of the stress I'd caused, I would never forgive myself, regardless of how justified my anger at my parents might be. But even in that moment of despair, I couldn't escape the knowledge of what my family had done to me and what they were continuing to do. The fake psychological evaluation wasn't just a legal tactic, it was a form of gaslighting designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and memories. They were trying to convince me that discovering their theft was evidence of mental instability rather than reasonable detective work, and that my anger about being robbed was proof that I needed psychiatric intervention rather than legal representation. Jake arrived at the hospital that evening, claiming that he'd heard about Grandma Rose's condition and wanted to help. But his real purpose became clear when he cornered me in the hospital cafeteria and made another offer that was supposedly generous, but was actually insulting. He suggested that if I agreed to return home immediately and submit to a psychological evaluation by a doctor of my parents' choosing, they would be willing to give me access to a small portion of the trust fund to cover my immediate expenses. The amount he mentioned was less than 1% of what they'd stolen from me over the years, but he presented it as if they were being incredibly generous and forgiving. When I refused his offer, Jake's demeanor changed completely. He told me that I was being selfish and unreasonable, and that I was putting Grandma Rose's health at risk with my stubborn refusal to accept help from my family. He suggested that if something serious happened to her, it would be my fault for insisting on pursuing a conflict that could have been resolved quietly and privately. He also mentioned that my parents were prepared to have me committed for psychiatric observation if I continued to behave irrationally, and that my refusal to accept their reasonable offers could be used as evidence that I was indeed mentally incompetent. The conversation with Jake was the lowest point of the entire experience. Here was my own brother, someone who'd supposedly loved me my entire life, threatening to have me institutionalized because I'd discovered that he and our parents had been stealing from me for years. He was using Grandma Rose's medical emergency as emotional blackmail to try to force me into submission, and he was presenting their theft as if it were somehow my fault for being too irresponsible to handle my own finances. That night, alone in the hotel room while Grandma Rose was being monitored in the hospital, I seriously considered calling my parents and accepting defeat. I drafted several different versions of surrender messages, apologizing for my behavior and asking them to help me get home safely. I researched what would be involved in a psychological evaluation and whether there was any chance I could satisfy their requirements and regain access to my funds. I even looked into the possibility of borrowing money from Sarah to cover my immediate expenses, though I knew that would create its own complications and dependencies. But every time I came close to sending one of those surrender messages, I remembered something else my family had stolen from me. It wasn't just the money, though that was certainly significant. It was the years of unnecessary financial stress and limitation. It was the shame I'd felt about being unable to afford things that my siblings took for granted. It was the way they'd made me feel guilty for wanting nice things or dreaming about travel and experiences that were beyond my supposed means. It was the confidence and self-respect they'd systematically undermined to keep me dependent and controllable. The turning point came when Grandma Rose was released from the hospital the next morning with a clean bill of health. The doctors determined that she'd suffered an anxiety attack rather than any kind of cardiac event, and they assured us that with proper rest and stress management, she would be fine. When I tried to apologize for putting her through such an ordeal, she stopped me and gave me the speech that changed everything. She told me that she'd lived through the Great Depression and World War II, and that she'd learned the difference between temporary setbacks and permanent defeats. What my parents had done to me was wrong, and no amount of intimidation or manipulation could change that fact. The money they'd stolen was mine by right, but more importantly, the truth about their behavior was something that deserved to be exposed regardless of the personal cost. She said that if we gave up now, they would continue to victimize other people, possibly including other family members who might inherit money or property in the future. Grandma Rose also reminded me that my grandfather had specifically created the trust fund to give his descendants freedom and opportunities, not to fund the comfortable lifestyle of thieves who happened to be related to him. She said that every day I allowed my parents to keep the money they'd stolen, I was betraying his memory and his intentions. If I truly wanted to honor him and the sacrifices he'd made to build wealth for future generations, I needed to fight for what was rightfully mine, regardless of how difficult or painful the process might be. But the most important thing Grandma Rose told me was that she'd found something in my grandfather's old papers that she hadn't mentioned before, something that could change everything about our legal position. She'd been saving this information as a last resort, but given how desperate our situation had become, she thought it was time to reveal what she'd discovered. That conversation gave me the strength to keep fighting, even though I had no idea what additional evidence she might have or whether it would be enough to overcome the legal obstacles my parents had created. The evidence Grandma Rose had been holding back turned out to be more powerful than I could have imagined. Among my grandfather's personal papers, she'd found a safety deposit box key and documentation showing that he'd maintained an account at a French bank with a branch office in Paris. The box contained original copies of the trust documents that were different from the versions my parents had filed with the American courts, as well as detailed letters explaining his concerns about my parents' character and his specific instructions for protecting the inheritance from potential family interference. The most damaging piece of evidence was a sealed letter addressed to me personally, to be opened only if there were ever questions about the trust administration or if I suspected that my parents were not acting in my best interests. In that letter, my grandfather explicitly stated that he'd created multiple layers of protection for the inheritance because he was concerned about my parents' financial judgment and their tendency to prioritize their own interests over family welfare. He'd also documented his observations of their behavior around money and their treatment of other family members in ways that suggested they couldn't be trusted with significant financial responsibility. But perhaps most importantly, the French bank records showed a pattern of irregular communications between my parents and bank officials that violated several international banking regulations. My parents had been trying to gain unauthorized access to information about my grandfather's European accounts for years, and they'd made false representations about their legal authority to manage family estate matters. These communications provided evidence of criminal intent that went far beyond simple bookkeeping errors or overly broad interpretations of fiduciary duty. Armed with this new evidence, I was able to contact a different lawyer who specialized in international financial crimes. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau was a French attorney who'd handled several high-profile cases involving American families and European banking irregularities. When I showed her the documentation from my grandfather's safety deposit box, she immediately recognized the significance of what my parents had done and assured me that we had grounds for both civil recovery and criminal prosecution in multiple jurisdictions. Dr. Morrow explained that my parents' attempts to freeze my American accounts might actually work in our favor because it created a clear pattern of financial manipulation and abuse that could be documented and presented to authorities. She suggested that we should move forward immediately with both a criminal complaint and a civil asset recovery action, using the French evidence to establish jurisdiction and credibility for our claims. She also recommended that we document everything about my parents' recent behavior, including their threats and intimidation tactics, as evidence of their consciousness of guilt. While we were building the legal case, I also decided to move forward with my original plan to go public with the story. The new evidence made the narrative even more compelling, and Dr. Morrow agreed that public pressure might help accelerate the legal processes in both countries. She warned me that going public would also increase the risks of retaliation from my family, but she pointed out that they'd already exhausted most of their legal options for silencing me, and that public exposure might actually provide some protection against further harassment. The decision to proceed with the live stream despite all the obstacles felt like the first truly empowered choice I'd made in the entire process. Instead of reacting to my family's attacks or trying to negotiate from a position of weakness, I was taking control of the narrative and forcing them to respond to my agenda rather than the other way around. The fact that I was doing it from Paris, using evidence my grandfather had specifically placed there for my protection, felt like a form of poetic justice that he would have appreciated. Preparing for the live stream while dealing with the ongoing legal crisis required incredible focus and determination. I had to organize complex financial evidence into a format that would be understandable to general audiences while also ensuring that I didn't accidentally compromise the criminal investigation or violate any confidentiality requirements. I worked with both Dr. Morrow and Patricia Wong to identify which documents could be shared publicly and which needed to remain confidential for legal reasons. The technical setup was more challenging than I'd originally planned because I wanted to include high-quality images of the evidence documents and clear audio for what might be a very long presentation. I invested in professional lighting equipment and multiple camera angles to ensure that viewers would be able to see everything clearly. I also prepared backup systems for internet connectivity and power because I knew that technical difficulties during such an important broadcast could undermine the entire effort. But the most difficult part of the preparation was emotional. I had to practice telling the most painful parts of my story repeatedly, including details about my family's treatment of me after I came out and their systematic efforts to undermine my confidence and independence. I had to prepare for the possibility that they would try to disrupt the broadcast or that viewers would be skeptical about my claims. Most importantly, I had to find a way to present the information objectively and factually without letting my anger and hurt overwhelm the message. Grandma Rose was invaluable during this preparation process. She helped me practice answering potential questions from viewers and coached me on how to stay focused on the facts rather than getting drawn into emotional territory that might discredit my presentation. She also contributed her own perspective on family events that I'd experienced as a child but hadn't fully understood at the time. Her presence added credibility to my story and demonstrated that I wasn't just a disgruntled young adult making accusations against innocent parents. As word of our preparations spread through our limited social circle, we started receiving messages of support from unexpected sources. Several family friends reached out privately to share their own observations about my parents' behavior and their suspicions about the family's financial situation. Some of my college friends offered to help promote the live stream through their own social media networks. Even Sarah's family, who barely knew me, expressed their support and offered to provide character references if needed for legal proceedings. But we also received warnings and threats from people who were loyal to my parents or who thought that family disputes should be handled privately regardless of what crimes might have been committed. Jake sent several messages threatening legal action if I proceeded with any public accusations against the family. My mother's sister called to lecture me about the importance of family loyalty and to suggest that I was being manipulated by Sarah and my new lawyers into making decisions I would regret. Even some of my childhood friends expressed concern about the wisdom of airing family business in such a public way. The pressure to back down was intense, but it also clarified something important about my motivations. This wasn't just about recovering the money my parents had stolen, though that was certainly important for my future financial security. This was about refusing to be silenced and controlled by people who'd been manipulating me my entire life. This was about standing up for myself and my right to live authentically without having to hide parts of my identity or accept financial limitations that were completely artificial. This was about holding accountable people who'd committed serious crimes while hiding behind the facade of family respectability. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 week after my parents had disinvited me from the family celebration, I was ready to tell the world what they'd really been doing all these years. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. While they were probably sitting around their Christmas tree opening presents that had been bought with my stolen inheritance money, I was preparing to expose their crimes to potentially hundreds of thousands of strangers. It felt like the most appropriate Christmas gift I could give myself, the truth and the freedom that came with finally refusing to keep other people's secrets. Christmas Eve in Paris was unusually quiet as I set up the equipment for what would become the most important conversation of my life. The hotel suite was perfectly lit, with the Eiffel Tower visible through the window behind me, creating a backdrop that immediately communicated the luxury and sophistication that my parents had been hiding from me for years. Grandma Rose sat beside me, wearing her best dress and the pearls my grandfather had given her for their 50th wedding anniversary, looking every inch the dignified family matriarch who was finally ready to speak truth to power. I started the stream at exactly 8 p.m. Paris time, which I'd calculated would reach the maximum number of viewers across American time zones. Within the first few minutes, the viewer count climbed from dozens to hundreds to thousands as word spread through social media networks and people shared the link with friends and family. The chat feed was moving so quickly that I could barely read individual comments, but the engagement was exactly what I'd hoped for. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Matthews, and I'm broadcasting live from Paris on Christmas Eve to tell you a story about family, money, and the difference between keeping secrets and protecting criminals. I held up a folder of documents and looked directly into the camera. For the past 8 years, my parents have been systematically stealing from a trust fund that my grandfather established for my benefit. Tonight, I'm going to show you exactly how they did it, how much they took, and what happened when I finally discovered the truth. The reaction in the chat was immediate and intense. Viewers were expressing everything from shock to support to skepticism about such serious accusations being made against family members. But I'd prepared for this range of responses, and I methodically began presenting the evidence that documented every aspect of the theft. I showed bank statements side by side with claimed expenses, highlighted patterns of fraudulent billing, and explained how the forged guardianship documents were designed to keep me from accessing my own inheritance. Grandma Rose's presence added a level of credibility that I couldn't have achieved on my own. When she spoke about my grandfather's intentions for the trust fund and her own observations of my parents' suspicious financial behavior over the years, viewers could see that this wasn't just the complaint of a spoiled young adult who felt entitled to family money. This was a systematic pattern of elder abuse, financial fraud, and family manipulation that had been going on for almost a decade. About 30 minutes into the stream, my phone started ringing constantly with calls from my family members who'd obviously been alerted to the broadcast. I'd expected this, so I'd put the phone on silent, but I could see Jake's name, then Lisa's, then my parents' numbers appearing repeatedly on the screen. The fact that they were trying so desperately to reach me while I was exposing their crimes only reinforced the validity of what I was revealing to the viewers. The breakthrough moment came when I displayed the original trust documents that Grandma Rose had found in my grandfather's French safety deposit box. These documents were significantly different from the versions my parents had filed with American courts, and they included specific language about protecting the inheritance from family interference and ensuring that I would have full access to the funds when I reached adulthood. The contrast between my grandfather's stated intentions and my parents' actual behavior was so stark that even skeptical viewers began expressing outrage in the chat. But the most dramatic moment of the entire stream occurred when Jake actually managed to call into the broadcast through a viewer who was watching with him. I'd set up the stream to accept video calls from viewers, thinking it would add an interactive element, but I hadn't anticipated that my family would use this feature to confront me in real time. Suddenly, Jake's angry face appeared on the screen, and he began shouting accusations and threats while thousands of viewers watched. "Rebecca, you need to stop this right now. You're humiliating the entire family with these lies and accusations. Mom and Dad are good people who've done everything they could to help you, and you're repaying them by spreading vicious rumors on the internet. This is exactly the kind of unstable behavior that proves you need professional help, not access to large amounts of money." The irony of Jake's interruption was perfect for my purposes. Instead of damaging my credibility, his angry and defensive response actually validated everything I'd been saying about my family's manipulative behavior. Viewers could see exactly how he tried to gaslight me by calling documented evidence, lies, and accusations, and how he attempted to pathologize my legitimate anger about being robbed. His threats and insults, broadcast live to thousands of people, demonstrated the family dynamic I'd been describing better than any explanation I could have provided. I remained calm and factual in my response to Jake's outburst. "Jake, everything I've shown tonight is documented with bank records, legal documents, and correspondence that viewers can verify for themselves. If you believe any of this information is incorrect, I encourage you to present evidence to the contrary. The fact that you're trying to intimidate me into silence instead of addressing the specific accusations tells viewers everything they need to know about the validity of my claims." After Jake's call ended, the viewer count exploded as people shared clips of the confrontation across social media platforms. The stream reached over 100,000 simultaneous viewers, with comments expressing shock at my family's behavior and support for my courage in exposing the truth. News outlets and bloggers began picking up the story in real time, and the hashtag trust fund theft started trending on multiple platforms. The most emotional moment of the stream came when I talked about the personal impact of my family's betrayal. I explained how they'd made me feel guilty for wanting things that were actually well within my financial means, how they'd undermined my confidence by constantly suggesting that I was irresponsible with money, and how they'd used my inheritance to fund their own luxury lifestyle while teaching me to live with artificial limitations. Viewers were particularly outraged when I described how my parents had disinvited me from Christmas after I came out, and how they'd tried to use my sexual orientation as evidence of mental instability. Grandma Rose concluded the stream with a powerful statement about the importance of standing up to bullies, even when those bullies are family members. She talked about my grandfather's values and his specific wishes for how his legacy should be used to help future generations achieve independence and success. She also addressed the viewers directly, thanking them for witnessing our story and encouraging anyone else who might be experiencing family financial abuse to seek help and support. As the stream ended after nearly 3 hours, the viewer count had reached over 300,000 people across multiple platforms. The chat was filled with messages of support, offers of legal assistance, and expressions of outrage about my family's behavior. Several attorneys had contacted me through the platform offering to help with the case, and multiple news organizations were requesting interviews about the story. Most importantly, law enforcement agencies in both the United States and France had been alerted to the broadcast and were beginning preliminary investigations into the financial crimes I'd documented. The immediate aftermath of the stream was both exhilarating and terrifying. I'd finally told my truth to the world, and the response had been overwhelmingly supportive. But I also knew that my family would never forgive me for the public humiliation I'd caused them, and that there might be legal and personal consequences I couldn't predict. The point of no return had been crossed, and whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the way things had been before. That night, as Grandma Rose and I celebrated our successful broadcast with room service champagne and chocolate, we talked about what the future might hold. We both understood that the legal process would be long and complicated, and that my relationships with most of my family members were probably permanently destroyed. But we also felt a sense of liberation and empowerment that neither of us had experienced in years. For the first time in my adult life, I was living completely authentically, without having to hide parts of my identity or accept limitations that other people had imposed on me. The legal consequences for my family began almost immediately after the live stream ended. Within 48 hours, both American and French authorities had opened formal investigations into the financial crimes I'd documented, and my parents' assets were frozen pending further investigation. The emergency court order that had restricted my access to the trust fund was reversed when prosecutors presented evidence that it had been obtained through fraudulent representations, and I regained full control of my inheritance for the first time in my adult life. Jake lost his job at a financial services company within a week of the broadcast, after his employer determined that his involvement in family financial fraud created unacceptable liability for their firm. The house he'd bought with my stolen inheritance money was seized as proceeds of crime, and he faced both civil and criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy. Lisa's husband filed for divorce after learning about her participation in the theft, and she lost custody of her children when family court determined that her behavior demonstrated poor judgment and moral character. But the most satisfying consequence was watching my parents' carefully constructed social facade crumble under public scrutiny. The community reputation they'd valued so highly was destroyed overnight, as neighbors, colleagues, and family friends learned about their criminal behavior through news coverage and social media. The country club expelled them for conduct unbecoming to members. Their church asked them to stop attending services until the legal matters were resolved. And several business relationships were terminated due to concerns about their integrity and trustworthiness. The financial recovery process took several months, but ultimately I was able to recoup nearly all of the money that had been stolen from the trust fund. My parents' luxury purchases were liquidated, their vacation properties were sold, and garnishments were placed on their income and retirement accounts to satisfy the judgment against them. They went from living a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle funded by my inheritance to struggling with basic financial obligations while facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and restitution payments. Grandma Rose emerged from the experience as something of a family hero, praised by relatives and friends for her courage in supporting me against such overwhelming family pressure. She decided to sell her house and move into a beautiful assisted living community that offered her more social opportunities and activities while still maintaining her independence. For the first time in years, she was able to travel and enjoy experiences that had been beyond her reach when she was living on a fixed income that my parents had convinced her was appropriate for her circumstances. My relationship with Sarah grew stronger and deeper through the crisis, as she supported me through the most difficult period of my life without ever asking for anything in return. We moved in together 6 months after returning from Paris and began planning a future that included marriage, children, and the kind of financial security that would allow us to pursue our dreams without compromise. Sarah had been particularly moved by the response to our story from LGBTQ viewers who'd shared their own experiences with family rejection and financial manipulation, and she encouraged me to use my platform to help other people in similar situations. The philanthropic work became one of the most rewarding aspects of my new life. I established the Rose Matthews Foundation, named after my grandmother, to provide financial assistance and legal support for LGBTQ young adults who'd been cut off from family resources due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. The foundation also supported research into family financial abuse and worked to educate people about the warning signs of inheritance theft and estate manipulation. Within the first year, we'd helped over 200 individuals recover stolen assets or gain access to resources that family members had been withholding. The media attention from the live stream led to opportunities I'd never imagined. Several publishers offered book deals for my story, and I ultimately chose to work with an editor who understood the importance of addressing both the personal and legal aspects of family financial abuse. The book became a bestseller and helped raise awareness about inheritance theft as a form of domestic abuse that was much more common than most people realized. I also developed a documentary series about financial crime that featured other families who'd experienced similar betrayals, giving voice to survivors who'd previously felt isolated and powerless. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from my grandfather's alma mater, which invited me to speak at their commencement ceremony about the importance of ethical behavior in family and business relationships. Standing at that podium, looking out at hundreds of young graduates who were about to enter the adult world, I talked about my grandfather's values and his belief that wealth should be used to create opportunities rather than control people. I told them that the most important legacy anyone could leave was a commitment to treating family members with honesty, respect, and genuine love rather than manipulation and exploitation. 1 year after the Christmas Eve broadcast, Grandma Rose and I returned to Paris to celebrate the anniversary of our victory. We stayed at the same hotel, visited the same restaurants, and recreated many of the activities we'd enjoyed during that life-changing week. But this time, we weren't hiding our wealth or preparing for battle against family members who'd betrayed us. We were simply two women who'd survived a terrible ordeal and emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed to living authentically than ever before. Lisa was the only family member who eventually reached out to apologize and attempt reconciliation. After spending a year in therapy and losing her marriage due to her participation in the financial fraud, she began to understand the full scope of what had been done to me and her own role in perpetuating the abuse. Her apology was genuine and comprehensive, acknowledging not just the theft, but also the way she'd sabotaged my relationships and undermined my confidence for years. We began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship, though I made it clear that trust would have to be earned back through consistent actions rather than just words. My parents and Jake never apologized or acknowledged any wrongdoing, even after being convicted of multiple felonies related to the theft. They continued to maintain that they'd been acting in my best interests and that I was ungrateful for all the sacrifices they'd made raising me. This lack of remorse actually made it easier for me to accept that our relationships were permanently over, because it confirmed that they were more committed to their own narrative than to genuine accountability or family reconciliation. The experience taught me invaluable lessons about the difference between family by birth and family by choice. Sarah, Grandma Rose, and the community of supporters we'd built through the foundation became my real family. The people who celebrated my successes without jealousy and supported me through difficulties without conditions or manipulation. Blood relationships that were based on control and exploitation couldn't compete with chosen relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. As I reflect on everything that happened, I'm most grateful for the opportunity to honor my grandfather's memory by using his legacy the way he'd intended. The trust fund wasn't just about money, it was about freedom, opportunity, and the power to make choices based on personal values rather than external pressure. By standing up to my parents' theft and manipulation, I'd not only recovered my inheritance, but also claimed my right to live authentically and make my own decisions about how to use the resources he'd provided. The Christmas Eve broadcast had given me something more valuable than money. It had given me my voice. For years, I'd accepted other people's versions of reality and allowed them to define my worth and capabilities. But standing up in front of hundreds of thousands of strangers and telling my truth had been an act of self-liberation that changed everything about how I saw myself and my place in the world. I was no longer someone who needed protection or guidance from people who claimed to know better than I did about my own life. I was an independent adult who could make my own choices and accept responsibility for the consequences, good or bad. Now, every Christmas Eve, I think about that moment when I decided to stop keeping my family's secrets and start telling my own truth. It was the scariest and most empowering decision I'd ever made, and it led to a life that my grandfather would have been proud to see his legacy support. The money he'd left me had provided financial security, but the courage to fight for it had given me something even more precious. The knowledge that I was strong enough to stand up for myself against anyone who tried to exploit or manipulate me, regardless of their relationship to me or their claims about acting in my best interests. What would you have done if you discovered that your family had been stealing from you for years while making you feel guilty about money that was rightfully yours? Have you ever had to choose between keeping family peace and standing up for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you think people should know the truth about family financial abuse. Subscribe to my channel for more stories about standing up to manipulation and living authentically, and share this video with anyone who might be dealing with similar family dynamics. Thank you for witnessing my story and supporting my journey toward independence and healing. I hope that sharing my experience helps other people find the courage to protect themselves from family members who prioritize their own interests over genuine love and respect. Remember that you deserve relationships built on honesty and mutual support, and that family loyalty should never require you to accept abuse or exploitation. Wishing everyone a Christmas filled with authentic love and the freedom to be exactly who you're meant to be.